In this video, we're going to learn how to create a production-ready setup for our Django project settings. And we're going to learn how to cater this setup to different environments. For example, to a dev environment, a production environment, and also a test environment. And this allows us to create settings that are optimized for the environment that we're working in or deploying to. If you're enjoying this content, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more, and let's dive in. Now we're going to follow some best practices that are defined in this style guide for Django, and this is provided by Hacksoft, and there's a link to this in the description of the video. If we look at the table of contents here, we have style guide recommendations here for different parts of a Django application, for example for models and for services and also for APIs and serializers. Now there's also a section here on settings, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video, so let's click that. Now this style guide's recommendations for Django settings are going to be similar to the cookie cutter Django project, which is another way you can bootstrap a Django application, but there are a few differences and we're going to cover some of that in this video. Now before we dive into this, I've got a project open in VS Code, and this is a project that I've called Settings Demo, and we're going to look at what Django provides out of the box when you run the start project command. We have a settings.py file within the project folder, and that's what I've got open just now. And this settings.py file contains all of the default settings provided when you start a Django project. So key settings like the base directory, the secret key, and so on. Now, as well as the project directory here, we also have a manage.py file, and you'll be familiar with this file if you run commands like make migrations and run server. And within this command, there is a main method, and this is the line of code that tells Django here where to find the default settings module. So what we're doing is reading from the environment here with the os.environ. That will return a dictionary of keys and values, and it's the Django settings module key that we want to look at here. And that's set to the relative path to the settings.py file that we want to use in this environment. So as you can see, when you start the project, it's got the project name, and that's settings demo, and it's pointing at the settings.py file within that folder. Now we're going to gradually work through the project here and change the structure of the settings so that they conform with the Hacksoft recommendation. So this is going to be quite a theoretical video, but we're going to do a lot of work in VS Code to actually restructure things and show how you would set up your project for local development, for testing, and for production. Now before we go on, as well as this setting here being defined in the manage.py file, it's also defined in the 𝗙sci𝗳𝗄𝗏 file, and this provides the 𝗙sci config for your project, and the same setting is also defined in the 𝗙sci𝗳𝗄𝗏 file, and that will be important if you're using something like Django channels and working with WebSockets. Now we're going to amend this structure, and we're going to show how to read in values from an environment file, and we're going to change some of the names here. So let's go back to the Hacksoft documentation, and we can see the folder structure for a typical project. So all of the settings live in a config directory, and there are two subdirectories within that, one for Django specific settings for each environment, for example a base setting, local settings, production, and test settings. And as well as Django settings, we have another folder in the config directory, and that's called settings, and that contains any settings for third-party applications and services. So for example, if you're using Celery, you might have a celery.py file for that configuration, and also things like Sentry, AWS, and so on. Now also within this config directory, we have a urls.py file and also the 𝗙sci and 𝗖𝗵𝗽 files. And we have an env.py file that we're going to look at later. So basically, in order to replicate this, we need to rename the settings demo to config. So I'm going to do that just now in VS Code. Let's rename that config. And then we're going to create two directories within the config folder. One is going to be called Django, and that's going to host the Django specific settings. And we'll also create one called settings for the third-party settings. Now we need to update a few references because we've changed the name of the project folder from settings demo to config. So for a start, let's go to settings.py. And I'm going to search for the original name, which was settings demo. Now the root URL configuration should point to urls.py, and that is now in a directory called config. So we're going to update that. And if we search through this file again, we also need to update the 𝗙sci application variable. So we're going to change settings demo to config again for that. And the only other reference is this comment here. So let's just quickly update that as well. Now we also need to update these pointers to the Django settings module. Before we do that, within the Django directory, we're going to create some files. So let's start with an init.py file. And I'm going to create files that match what's here. So one for each environment that we're using. So we're going to have a base.py file that contains all of the base settings for the project. And then we're also going to create a local.py file for local development, production.py for prod, and test.py for our tests. So let's go back to VS Code, and within the Django directory, we'll create the base.py file. And what I'm going to do is copy all of the configuration from settings.py. So let's cut that out of there and paste it here into the base.py file. So these are now the base settings for the Django project. And we can now remove settings.py from the config directory. So now we have this base.py file that contains all of our default settings. We're going to create a new file called local.py, and what we do here is we import everything from the base file. So at the top here from the base.py file, let's import every single setting that we define there. And what we need to do for local development is basically overwrite anything that we want to define, or rather that we want to change from this base file in the local development environment. Now we'll see more examples of that later. That's literally all we need at the moment. We're just importing all of the base settings, and I'm going to do the same in the production.py file. So at the top from base, let's import everything, and the same for tests.py as well. So we're importing all of the base settings in each one of these files, and those files are environment specific settings files. Now let's see an example of how you might overwrite one of these settings. So in base.py we have a setting called debug, and that's set to true, which is what you want during development. But let's go to production.py, and what I'm going to do quickly here is overwrite that, and we're going to set debug to false. And that's very important in production. You don't want to be exposing any internal code or settings or stack traces to your users. By setting debug to false, if there's an exception or if there's any issues with the application in production, those kind of details are not going to be leaked out to any potentially malicious users. Now, of course, we don't want to be hard coding environment variables like this within our application. What we're going to do is create a .env file, and we're going to move some of the settings to that file. So now we're going to go back to the root of the project, and I'm going to create a file here called .env. Now I'm going to paste some values into this .env file. We're going to set the Django settings module, and this time we're pointing it at config.django.local. Now I'm on my local computer, and let's say we're developing the application. In that kind of environment, we want to set the settings module to the local.py file. And of course, if you're in production, you can change local to production.py in that case, and that's going to apply the settings from the production.py file that you can see here. We're also setting the Django debug variable to true, and the secret key we are setting to the value secret. Now, in order to read this stuff from the environment, we're going to install a package called Django-environ. So I'm going to open a terminal here, and I have a Python virtual environment activated, and we're going to run pip install Django-environ. So let's execute that, and that's going to install that package into your environment. And again, I'm going to go back to the Hacksoft documentation here on settings. And as you can see, you get more information here about what each of these files should contain. If we scroll down, you can see that what we also have is an env.py file, and that's where we use Django-environ. So in a single location in our settings, a single place, we can instantiate one of these environment objects, and that's going to allow us to read in the variables from the .env file. And then wherever we need to read something from the environment, all we need to do is import the env object from that particular file. Now I'm going to follow that structure now, so let's go back to the project, and within the config folder, let's create a new file called env.py. And we can go back to the style guide and copy these 2 lines of code and paste them into env.py. And one other thing that I want to do is set up the base directory, so it's base_dir. If we go back to the base.py file, we have a base directory set up here, but I want to move that into env.py. What I'm going to do is copy this pathlib statement, and we're going to go back here, and we're going to set it equal to that. And we also need to import pathlib's path object at the top of this file. So from pathlib, let's import path. So if we look at this line of code, the base directory is set to the path of the current file, which is env.py, and that's in the config directory. So when we resolve the current file here, if we look at the parent of that, that's going to be the config directory, and then the parent of that is going to be the project root, and we're setting the base directory to that. So now whenever we need to read anything from the environment, we can just import this. And what I'm going to do is go back to base.py here, and we're actually going to import the env object and the base directory from that particular file. So let's do that now. At the top, from the config directory's env file, let's import the base directory as well as the env object. And I'm also just above that going to import the Python OS module. And once we've done that, we can remove the base directory from this base.py file because we're now defining that in the env.py file. And we can now use this env object here from Django-environ to read the values from a .env file. So let's see how to do that now in base.py. We're going to use the env object, which has a function called readenv, and that takes an environment file that you want to read from. So I'm going to use the os.path.join method in Python, and the .env file is in the base directory and it's called .env. And I think you could actually just use the pathlib syntax for this, but let's just keep it at os.path.join for now. And the purpose of this is to populate the environment object with the values from the .env file. And once we've done that, we can refer to these environment variables. So for example, for the secret key, I'm going to remove this hard-coded string, and we're going to use the env object and read the secret key variable, which is defined in that .env file. You can see that here it's set to a value of secret, so we're reading that in here using the Django-environ object. And similarly for debug, we can read that from the environment. So we're going to read a variable here called Django_debug, and that corresponds to the name that we gave it here in the .env file. So if we go back to base.py, we're reading that here, and we can actually cast that to a Boolean value by using the .bool method on the environment object. And we can also give it a default value. So for example, the default could be true. And then finally for the allowed hosts setting, let's set that to the wildcard, and that's going to allow this to be hosted on any platform. Now we can change these however we want in the other settings modules. So for example, for production.py, we might want to change some of this configuration. What I'm going to do is copy these two lines of code, and we're going to go to production.py and I'm going to paste these in. Now for the debug setting, again we want to read this Django debug variable from the environment, but definitely we don't want to be setting the default to true in production, so let's set that to false. And for allowed hosts, this is something that we probably want to read in from the .env file. So what we're going to do is use that environment object from Django-environ, and we're going to read in the allowed hosts setting, and we're going to default that to an empty list. Now notice in the .env file, we're not defining the allowed hosts setting. So that's actually going to default to the empty string in production.py. And of course, we also need to import the env object. So I'm going to copy the import from base.py. Let's copy this and paste that into production.py as well. And we don't need the base directory. We can just import the env object. So the power of this setup is that we now have a settings file for each environment, for local, for production, and for testing. And all of these are importing the settings from the base module, and anything that needs to be overwritten based on the environment, you can do that here within each of these files. Now the final thing to do is look at manage.py, and we're going to change the Django settings module. That's referencing the old settings.py file. So what we're going to do is go to the config folder, and the name of the module, it's in the Django folder within config, and it's going to be base.py. And in fact, because we're on local, we can set this to local.py instead. The key insight here though is that if we run a server that has a Django settings module that points to, let's say, production.py, then this is not going to apply the default. It's going to set it to production, and that allows you to very easily switch from one set of settings to production settings instead. Now I'm going to copy this line of code. We need to also set this in the asgi.py file, so let's paste it in here. And once we've done that, we can do the same with the 𝗬𝗚ci.py file, so let's paste that here. Again, we're just telling Django where the settings are going to be defined based on that Django settings module environment variable. Now I want to test this out and just make sure everything is working, so I'm going to clear the terminal and I'm going to run python manage.py, and we're going to run the shell command. And that's going to open up the Django shell. And what we can do at the top here from django.conf is we can import the settings. So let's do that now. And let's test the values of these settings. So for example, settings.secretKey. If we access that, you can see we get the value of secret. And that's the value that was defined in the .env file, as you can see here. So we know that these are being correctly read in from the environment. We can also check the value of settings.debug. So let's do that just now. Settings.debug. We can see that that's set to true. And finally, settings.allowed hosts, we can see that that's set to that wildcard. Now what we're going to do is change the value of the Django settings module. That's this value here that's read in through the environment. Now I'm on PowerShell on Windows here, so what I'm going to do is exit out of the shell, and we're going to set an environment variable here, so it's the env object, and we're going to set another key called Django_settings_module. And I'm going to point that to production.py. So let's set that to config.django.production. And that's the path to the production.py file. And remember, that's importing everything from base.py and it's overriding what it needs to set independently. If we execute that, it's going to store the new value for the Django settings module into the environment. Now, I'm doing this manually on the terminal. What you could do, and what you would typically do on a Linux system, is change the value in the .env file. So for example, to production here. And then you can use the source command or something similar to source the values in this .env file and add them to the environment. And if you need to set the value on Linux, you can use the export command. So export Django settings module, and you can point it to the same value here. Now I'm going to clear the terminal. And again, let's run the Django shell. So Python manage.py shell. And I'm going to scroll up here through the previously executed commands. We're going to import settings again. And if we look at settings.allowed hosts, you can see that that's now an empty list. And beforehand, that was set to that wildcard. So why is this happening? We now have our settings module pointing to production.py. And if we go to that file, you can see that allowed hosts is not hard-coded to that wildcard. Instead, we're trying to read a value from the .env file called allowed hosts. And because that doesn't exist, it's falling back to the default of an empty list. So we now have a Django configuration that we can very easily change based on our environment. We just change the settings file that the environment is pointing to in order to load the particular settings that we want, for example, for local development or for production, or if you have a staging server, you could include one for that, or for tests. So just to go over what we've done, we've defined a base.py file that contains all of the base settings. And then each environment specific file will import all of those, and anything that needs to be overwritten based on that environment, you can do that within those files. And finally, we're leveraging the Django settings module environment variable to point to the correct file. Let's now move on, and we're going to have a look at third-party configuration. Now, as the Hacksoft guide said, we have within config two folders, one for Django specific settings that we've already looked at. And we also have a file called settings here, and that's where we might want to place third-party configuration. Now, often when you build Django applications, you want to integrate with third-party services such as AWS or Azure. You might want to use things like Celery for your tasks. You might want to use Sentry for monitoring, Google Analytics. You might want to use email providers and so on. If you're building any kind of big application, the chances are you're going to need to integrate with third-party packages. Now, Hacksoft would recommend storing these kind of settings within a settings directory underneath the config directory. So let's see an example of this now, and let's imagine that we're using Celery for our Django tasks. And this is very common in a Django application. If you're doing any kind of background processing, you might want to offload that to a Celery task. What we're going to do within the settings directory is create a new file called celery.py. And essentially what we're going to do is define all Celery configuration in this file. Now, when you use Celery, typically you're going to read values from the environment because you need to define a broker URL. And the Celery broker is typically RabbitMQ or Redis. And that's going to be set up on your system or on a Docker container, and you need to point Celery towards that. So we're definitely going to need to get this env object from the config.env file. And then I'm going to add some Celery settings here. So let's say the broker URL, we need to define that. And that's going to be defined by looking at the environment and getting that value. So our .env file should contain this value. I'm going to add a dummy URL here. And I'm going to set it to this URL. So we're using the Redis protocol and we're connecting to Redis on port 6379. And this is going to be our Celery broker URL. So let's close the .env file. And I'm going to paste in a couple of extra settings. So let's imagine we're using Django Celery results. And that's an extension for storing your task results in the database using Django. So we set the Celery result backend to Django DB. And for extended information, you can set Celery result extended to true. Now, I'm not actually going to set up Celery here. We're just giving some example configuration. And because it's a third-party service, because it's not part of Django itself, we're defining this in a celery.py file in the settings folder. Now I'm going to quickly create another file in this settings folder, and let's call it file_storage.py. Let's imagine that we're storing files on Amazon S3, and that's a cloud-based object storage service for AWS. Now again, that's a third-party service, and we need to set up some configuration in order to connect to S3. Now the easiest way to do that is to use a package called Django Storages. And we did a video on this that should be appearing on the screen now, so check that out if you want to learn more. But there are some settings that you need to define in order to allow your application to upload files and other content to Amazon S3. Now I'm going to paste in this code. I don't want to go over this too much, but what we have here is, again, we're importing the env object from that 𝗵𝗽 file. And we're defining a setting here called storages. Now in previous versions of Django, this was called default file storage. But starting with Django 4.2, the default file storage engine can be configured using a setting called storages, and that's set to a dictionary. Now within that dictionary, where you want your files to actually be stored is set up using this backend, and you can see that it's using a Django storages backend called S3 storage. So we're setting that up, and below we have some configuration for actually connecting to AWS itself. Now in order to connect to AWS, you need an access key, a secret key, and for S3 we also need a storage bucket name and a region name. We're using the env object to read those in, and that means we need to define them in the .env file. So I'm going to go back to that file and paste in some dummy settings. So we have a bucket called myBucket, and that's in EU West 2. And of course these are not real access and secret keys. So we're nearly finished with this, so well done if you've stuck this far into the video. What we're going to do is go back to file storage.py and save this file. So we now have two third-party settings files, one for Celery and one for file storage that uses Amazon S3. The final thing we need to do is go back to base.py, and at the bottom of this file, what I'm going to do is import those third-party configurations. So from config.settings, we had a Celery module for our Celery settings. We're going to import all of the settings from that at the bottom of base.py. And I'm going to do the same for config.settings.file_storage. And again, that's going to import everything from Celery.py and filestorage.py into the base.py file. And remember, that means that they are going to be imported by everything else. So for example, for local development, we've imported everything from base, and because we're now importing everything from these files, that means that everything is going to be available locally, and the same for production and for testing. And as well as these settings, as I said earlier, we could add Sentry configuration at the bottom here, and we could also add settings for things like Google OAuth or GitHub authentication. So if you need some kind of social authentication, you could define the setting and then import it here. And you could also add email settings here too. And you can imagine that if your environment is not production, you don't want to be sending emails when you're developing and testing. So you could set the email backend to the console in that case. Otherwise, in production, in other words, in production.py here, you could overwrite those settings and you could set it to a proper SMTP service, for example, Amazon SES. So now that we have the third-party settings, I want to test this out. So let's go back to the terminal here, and I'm going to reload the Django shell, and we can do that with manage.py shell. And again, from django.conf, let's import settings. And we want to look at the settings that we've defined in the third-party configuration, for example, storages. And we can see that the storages are now set to that S3 storage class. And similarly, if we clear the terminal, we can look at the Celery broker URL, and we get that Redis URL that we defined in the .env file. And let's do one more, settings.aws storage bucket name, and that's set to myBucket. Again, that's from the .env file. So we can now import these third-party settings, and these are now separated into distinct files within the config/settings directory. Now there's only one more thing to show, and it's not going to take long. This is a best practice when you have these .env files. So what we have here is a bunch of values, but if you give this project to a new developer, the .env file is not going to be included from GitHub or GitLab because you should not commit this to source control. And that's obvious because it contains API keys and passwords and so on. This is a sensitive file that should be added to your gitignore file. But you need some way of telling developers what the expected environment variables are going to be. So what you can do is create another file at the root of the project, and that can be called .env.example. And this is a file that can be committed to GitHub or GitLab, and it can indicate to your developers what the expected settings are going to be, and it can also give some default or dummy values for those settings. So as an example here, I've pasted in some configuration. We're setting the settings module to local.py, and we're setting some extra ones here, and this allows developers to look at this file and say, well, we need the Celery broker URL to be part of the environment. So for local development, we need to set this appropriately, and same with all of the AWS settings. The important thing is that in the example.env file, we don't commit any passwords or secret keys. This just contains some dummy values for what we expect the settings to be. So when a new developer comes into the project and they inherit this application from GitHub, they can create a .env file from the example, and they can find the values for things like the secret key or the broker URL from password managers or other tools like that. So that's all for this video. We've seen how to create a configuration in Django that allows you to create environment-specific settings for things like local development, for production, for testing, and so on. And we've also seen how to use the Django settings module variable to control which settings file is loaded in your environment. And we saw how to separate your configuration into Django specific settings as well as third-party integrations. And we saw how to use Django-environ to load in values from an environment file. And we can then reference values from the environment in our different settings files. For example, using env.bool to read in Django debug setting. So whenever we need to read in anything from the environment file, we can use this env object. So thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. And if you're enjoying this content, consider buying the channel a coffee. There's a link in the description. Otherwise, thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.